Hi everyone, today we have another very special guest, Surya Ramachandran. Surya is an engineer from Chennai who later pursued his passion into the wild. His jungle journey commenced in the forests of Satpura National Park at the Forsyths Lodge. He started as an intern and then has become a full-time naturalist. The need to guide people encouraged him to write a book, and he successfully authored the Photo Field Guide to Central India and is now working on a photo guide to South India, which covers 1,860 species in South India. He's also one of the certified expedition leaders for the WWF International and their donors. His passion and dedication have led him to be awarded the prestigious Toft Award for the year 2016. Surya believes that the key to sustainable ecotourism is to keeping the locals at the helm. He is currently working on creating wildlife tours in offbeat destinations and setting up wildlife lodges and experiences in the Trans-Himalayan belt with the snow leopard and other lesser fauna present there. Welcome, Surya.
Thank you, Latika.
Great to talk to you.
Finally,
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Basically, today I thought I should speak about a few things with regards to how the whole idea of finding snow leopards in the mountains of the Trans-Himalaya started, who are the people behind it, and what shape it has taken over the years to get to where it is now, and what has been the journey, the influences, the various ups and downs of it. And of course, finally actually getting into what goes into finding a cat. So that's kind of what I want to put together today. And to start with, of course, this is the quintessential image of the Trans-Himalayan mountains of Ladakh, which people have, a large monastery on the mountaintop, looking down on a small village with broad valleys. Of course, the Indus flowing through the main valley in between the mountains. So that is the picture of Ladakh which most of the world has, and that's what people have been coming to see: the Silk Route, the landscapes, the people, the beautiful culture of the region, the old forgotten monuments. So that is what has been the attraction for Ladakh ever since its opening to the outside world in 78 or 74, if I'm not sure if I'm getting the date right. It's 74 or 78. So there's a whole lot of secrets that have been unfolding over time. So it was an interesting mix for a whole new variety of people who had various interests, like anthropology. There was, of course, architecture. There was a lot of history. There's a lot of people trying to find the spiritual side to life. So there's a whole lot of different things happening in this newfound landscape which is open to the world. And of course, along with all of that came the casual tourist who was just keen to go there and see the mountains, take in the weather, take in the sights, and of course the whole culture of Ladakh with the cheerful local Buddhist folk with their welcoming jules. All of that put together, the place had something really going for itself. But amongst all that, there was one final thing that brought in a whole new set of people into the landscape, and that is this animal, the snow leopard. So it took a long time for this process to become one of the mainstream tourist attractions for Ladakh, or one of the main income generators for the local population, I'll put it that way. But there was a lot of people involved, like I told you, in this process, and I want to just talk about that. How we came from actually thinking that it's an animal which is impossible to see, to taking pictures like this, barely in a span of 15 to 16 years. And that is kind of how the understanding of this animal and the way people are working with this animal has transformed over time. So before we actually jump into the snow leopard, I'd like to tell you where exactly we are in the world and where we are talking about. This is, of course, a map of northern India, and you can see that the arc of the Himalayas goes cutting through the landscape from the right bottom of the frame all the way to the center with all the snow-capped peaks. You can see like it's a curve of white. And the landscape to the south of it is lush green, and the landscape to the north of it, of course, is drab and brown. So that is because the Himalayas have kind of formed a barricade for the monsoon winds, the moisture-laden winds from the south. So the land to the north of it is called the Trans-Himalaya, and that is the area we are talking about. This landscape wasn't always like this. It wasn't always barren. There was, of course, a huge coming together of land masses around 50 million years ago, when the southern landmass from Gondwana, which broke off, moved north to hit the Eurasian plate, and that kind of pushed the Himalayas up. And that pushing up of the mountains has created this very shriveled, almost like a barren cold desert landscape to the north of it, and that is what we know as Ladakh. And the beauty of this whole thing is, if you go to the right spots in Ladakh, like Lato Valley, which I'm showing here, you can actually see this happening in front of your eyes. And that is why geology in Ladakh is another vast topic. I know a little bit about it, but I don't want to get into it too much today, because our topic of discussion is something else. Of course, in this Trans-Himalayan landscape, over time, the Silk Route was the main reason for its flourishing over the years. And the city of Leh benefited the most, and because it is right in the base of Kardungla, which helped people coming from the north, gave them a sarai, or a base in which they can stop and take rest, and also refuel, resupply, and carry on with their journey. And that was the city of Leh, which is the capital of Ladakh now. But if you leave the city of Leh, what you are seeing is a lot of mountains, a population density of less than 3 people per square kilometer. So essentially it's small villages, hamlets, and maybe largish villages set amongst the mountains, with a looming large grand monastery overlooking them from above a hilltop. So that is pretty much how the Ladakhi villages are, and most of them are self-sustaining villages. You can see they do, even when you visit any of these villages, you can see that they rearing sheep and goat, and of course yak and zo, which are the 2 different kinds of cattle they have, is probably the most important income for them. And during the short summer months, they grow their wheat and barley and some crops, because the soil is rich, mind you, despite the cold conditions. It's all alluvial soil, so the soil is rich and it supports a lot of farming. But unfortunately, because of the altitude where they are, which is at 4,000 meters, the winters can be quite harsh. So the farming period is only about 4 to 5 months. So in a sense, like I told you, with the population density of less than 3 people per square kilometer, you're looking at a 60,000 square kilometer wildlife sanctuary. Basically, the whole of Ladakh is wild, except for the little crowded spots along the Indus, the city of Leh. If you leave all these cities also, there is a lot of area to explore, and there's a lot of wildlife. But when you look at a landscape like this, despite the fact that it is people free and uninhabited, what is it that you're going to look for? I mean, how do you look for wildlife? This is not this like one of the first things that comes to mind when you think of a place where you go looking for big cats or butterflies or birds or anything of that sort. It looks lifeless. So of course there is a lot of life here, very beautifully adapted to this rocky landscape, where they can hide in plain sight. And the key to actually figuring out how to find things here is getting your eyes used to the landscape, and of course a whole lot of local knowledge. So here in this picture, right somewhere in the right middle, you can see a snow leopard perched beautifully on a rock in front of in the background of snow. And that is how beautifully well camouflaged these animals are. And it's not just the snow leopard that's so well adapted. You also have other ungulates and mammals over here, like this blue sheep or burrell. I mean, don't ask me why they call blue sheep. I think they do have a bluish grey tinge in the winter months. But essentially this is how they look. And this herd of, I think there are 5 animals here, was barely 20 meters away from me, just off the road. But if they hadn't moved, it would have been very, very difficult to see them. You can see how beautifully blended into the landscape they are. And apart from big mammals, there is a lot of things. There is snakes in this landscape, there's butterflies, there's dragonflies, there's amphibians, all of them beautifully adapted to blend in with the surroundings, and also adapted very well to the high altitude and the severe cold conditions. So keeping all this wildlife in mind, in the 1980s, Hemis National Park, you can see the red marker at the bottom of your screen, that's the location of Hemis National Park to the south of the Indus. So Hemis National Park was set up in the Zanskar range of Ladakh, and this happened to be the largest protected area in the country. It's called Hemis High Altitude National Park. And from there, the protection or the conservation of animals in Ladakh, the story of it started. But like I told you, Ladakh, the problems are different, the solutions are different, and there needed someone who had to dive deep into these problems to actually figure out a solution for the conservation of animals there and for the benefit of the people. So that person was, of course, the person you see on your screen, Dr. Rinchen Wangchuk from the Snow Leopard Conservancy Trust. And he, along with the Forest Department, did the initial preliminary work. Of course, Dr. Raghu Chandawat and Joanna and all these people did a lot of studies in the Marka Valley prior to him. But when he came in, there was a lot of conservation work as such, based on the data that was available to him that was started. So let me just give you in brief what his problems were. So Ladakh, like I told you, is a very farming oriented society. It didn't have much wood, so most of the corrals were open. The cattle and goats and sheep were actually open. The corrals were open to the sky on the top. So instances like this was very common, where a snow leopard would enter a village at night, jump in, take a lot of sheep and goat, and sometimes in the panic empty an entire pen of their sheep and go out with one or two, or sometimes get stuck in till the morning to get killed by the villagers. So there was a lot of negativity, despite the fact that the people revered this animal, revered all kinds of life, following their Buddhist culture. When your livelihood is being questioned by a wild animal, so there was that negativity and remorse. So there was retaliatory killing to an extent. There was a lot of negativity with regards to the snow leopard. So Rinchen wanted to tackle this situation. But before he actually gets to tackle or find a solution, he needed to understand this big cat, the snow leopard, which people knew so little of. I mean, starting from how to find it. You often see tracks, but how do you actually study an animal that you never see? What is the solution? So he had to figure out his own methods, and one of that which really helped him was camera trapping. That is what they did extensively in Hemis National Park, in a small area called Rumbak. That is where they did a lot of camera trapping, identified individuals, identified where they are moving, what they're doing, how they mark their territories, what is the number of cats in the area. Even such basic data took a lot of time to figure out, and that's what Rinchen and his team from the Snow Leopard Conservancy did so beautifully over time. And when they had this data, they felt it was time to start working with the locals, because without involving the local community, any kind of conservation work is going to be short term. The locals needed to benefit from the fact that there are big cats in their backyard, and if they didn't feel that way, Dr. Rinchen felt there is no future for whatever he was trying to do. So a lot of the villagers from that area and the surrounding villages were given training to be trackers and spotters. A lot of them were already involved in his study work, and a whole lot more people were also trained to find these cats, track them, and use the spotting scopes and the binoculars to find these cats in the mountains. And one other thing he did was he wanted the income to go directly to the villages when people come to see snow leopards. And for that, he created this network of homestays throughout Ladakh, wherever he felt there is a viable population of snow leopards. But of course, since there was a national park, a lot of attention went into the national park, and the homestays in the national park were given training, and they were given a whole lot of assistance to start hosting people, especially foreigners. And the rest is history. The sightings were great. The cats were quite habituated thanks to the work done by Rinchen and Dr. Raghu prior to him. So there was a lot of things going for Ladakh at that time. So snow leopard viewing in the winter months became very popular. The homestays suddenly became very full. The spotters were fantastic at what they did. So people from all over the world, despite the harsh conditions, decided to come and spend the harsh winter months in the Hemis National Park in search of the grey ghost of the mountains, as it was popularly known. But as you can imagine, because Rumbak, a single spot, became very popular, slowly the homestays became too full. Like I said, Rumbak is a small village. It has only around 12 to 15 houses, and my number could be wrong, but it's somewhere around there. So when you have more people coming in, what happens is the travel agents from Leh and other places decided to put camps, and suddenly there was a situation where you had 200 odd people on a particular big cat. And of course, the other thing was the conditions in these in Rumbak was quite basic. Like, the people had to walk almost 1.5 hours to even reach their homestay, and walking 1.5 hours in 4,000 meters is not a joke in those cold conditions. And of course, the staying conditions, despite having a cheerful host and a lovely set of spotters, the homestays were basic and they were just what you needed to survive in that place. In fact, most of them had to sleep with sleeping bags, and it kind of wasn't a bad situation, to be honest, but it kept a whole lot of other enthusiasts away because they were averse to the cold or averse to the altitude or averse to the basic conditions. So there was a large chunk of wildlifers who didn't want to come to Ladakh or didn't want to go exploring the snow leopard viewing chances in the winter months. So that is when Dr. David Sonam from the Snow Leopard Conservancy Trust actually told us this is when we need to start moving out of the national park and go out and explore other areas where homestays have been set up in snow leopard habitat. And we were looking at a multiple set of areas before we closed in on the Sham area, which is actually an area where Dr. Latika has also been to, and she's had a great time there. So we actually found this spot, which was already, of course, discovered by Dr. Rinchan and his team. But what we felt was different about this place as compared to the national park was of course, they already existed homestays and there existed a whole lot of wildlife. These were the bare necessities. We needed a place to stay, and of course, we needed a good number of cats, a good number of wolves, and ungulates and other wildlife. So all those things were in place. But two factors contributed heavily to Ule and Mangyu becoming wildlife viewing hotspots, and that is this team of three, and of course other guys who later joined in. To the right is Norbu, and then there's Morup in the middle and Funsok to the left. These guys can weave magic, and how they find the cats is incredible. I mean, let me tell you one thing, if you go to Ladakh without one of these guys, you may not even see anything when you travel through the landscape looking for wildlife. You might see a few birds, but it is very difficult, and what they do on a daily basis is pretty much magic. So having guys like this, one of the best snow leopard trackers and spotters in the world, in this landscape which we were trying to move into, was a big added bonus. And the biggest advantage was the fact that we suddenly had roads. There was an entire network of roads connecting every village, every valley, and every mountain range in this new Sham area, which wasn't there in Hemis. So the roads gave us two advantages. We can now get people to the lodge and around to other areas without having the need to walk at 4,200 meters. And also, it kind of made it possible to explore a much wider area in search of cats. So suddenly we were looking for 13 to 14 cats, whereas in other places, because of your restriction to walking, you were probably looking only for 3 or 4 cats. So we had a lot more area to explore, and we could also visit other places like monasteries and things like that. So the experience was suddenly multifaceted, and that's kind of the advantage that this new landscape with its roads brought about. So we set up what we call now Snow Leopard Lodge, which is basically an upgraded homestay. We loaned money to the villagers who did up their homestay, and they were very happy to do it up with us. And basically, on a low interest basis, they were able to create a new property from an existing old basic homestay. And what we do is we lease it out from them and run on a year after year basis. So though we call it a Snow Leopard Lodge, it is basically just a beautiful homestay with where your comfort levels are a little higher. You actually have a proper dining, you have a toilet, and you have things like that which you didn't have during your stint in a tent or in a very basic homestay. So the ethos was the same, the experience was the same, it's just that the comfort levels were different, and suddenly you had a car to move around. But one of the main factors which we kept in mind while setting up these lodges was that we wanted to be in the right place. So this is the view from one of our lodges. Can you imagine that we are sitting in the heart of snow leopard country, and this is the one of the things that happens in our parking lot, which is one of the best places to see cats, because we have 3 or 4 different mountain ridges surrounding us, and most of the sightings or the viewings of cats are from our lodge ground. So this is our parking lot with Norbu's house behind, and all the photographers are watching a cat right from there, and it's quite amazing that all these things have come together to create this experience of ours. So in a nutshell, what happens now is that you fly from Delhi to Leh. There are a lot more flights. You stay in a comfortable hotel where you can acclimatize for the altitude for 2 to 3 days, and then you do a 2-hour drive to reach the lodge where you have a traditional welcome. You settle in, and it's a lot more comfortable than before. And basically that's how easy it's become as compared to what people would have imagined in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, how snow leopard tourism actually would have run in terms of climbing the mountains and reading George Schaler's book and things like that. This is what it has become in the course of just 16 to 17 years. This is kind of how the snow leopard tourism scenario has transformed. So, of course, when you say Snow Leopard Lodge, it's not just the snow leopards that we are talking about. We're looking about ibex, we're talking about ungulates like Uriel, which is a wild sheep. There is the blue sheep or burrel, which we already spoke about. There is pikas. There is, of course, the woolly hare, a lot of other small mammals. And, of course, canids like the red fox, which is found world over, which is now in this concept of Ladakh, it's called the Himalayan fox. And of course the forgotten carnivore of Ladakh, the Tibetan wolf, which is unfortunately always lived in the shadow of the snow leopard. And a lot of conservation focus needs to shift to this animal if we are actually going to save the population of wolves in Ladakh and probably the entire Tibetan landscape. And of course, great birds, iconic Himalayan birds like the golden eagle, the bearded vulture, the rose finches, the accenters, the partridges, a whole lot of different things to keep one engaged when the big cat is not showing up. So it is a holistic experience, but of course it is centered on this animal, the snow leopard. This is actually not a real snow leopard. I'm sorry, I don't know how well your screen can be seen, so I want to reiterate that this is not a real snow leopard. This is a doll made by the villagers, which we sell at the lodge, and that is actually an added income for the houses. So they make it out of sheep and yak wool. But when you actually talk about finding snow leopards, it's kind of understandable when you see them on the ridges, when they walk along the ridges of the mountains, because their silhouette is quite clear. But on most occasions, this is how it is. I mean, here in this photo, you have two snow leopards right in the middle. But when you're looking at this from like 200 to 300 meters away, it's so easy to miss them. And I just want to put into perspective what is the kind of magic that our boys weave on a daily basis when they find snow leopards. You can actually see that there are two snow leopards right in the middle here. Maybe later we can put circles around them and show you. But that is how difficult it can be to see these cats. I mean, just to give you another example, here is a landscape this is a ridge which we see from the lodge. And if I tell you there are 3 snow leopards here, including a mating pair, I mean, it'll take people who are not used to this landscape a lot of time to figure it out. But just to make it easier right now, I'm going to just put a couple of arrows. You can see the mating pair to the right, and of course the sub-adult cub or the female wondering what's happening to the left. And that is the level of magic that is being created on a daily basis by our spotters to make sure we see snow leopards. And this is the habitat. I mean, you're literally looking for a needle in a haystack, or a needle in a needle stack, to be honest. And their knowledge of the mountains, their knowledge of the habitat, and their knowledge of the cats goes a long way in helping find these cats. So, and when I say finding cats, there is a lot of difference between every viewing, of course. There are viewings which can go on from 500 meters away, which we watch with telescopes. So of course there are ones where the viewings can be not visible to the naked eye. So roughly when you have the cat at about 150 meters or 100 meters is when you can actually see the cat with your naked eye. So you're actually dependent heavily on the quality of the optics, for which we've actually got Zeiss and Swarovski with us, mostly Zeiss, who have sponsored us at the lodge. So we have very good optics to make sure you can actually use the optics to capture images by putting a camera on the optics. So most of the sightings are like that. But there are instances where you have kills that are made, and like you must have seen a lot of videos. Snow leopards generally hunt from the higher ridges and chase the prey down. So a lot of the hunts are along the mountain gullies, and the prey is usually at the lower slopes or in the valley floor, and that's where you can find the kills. So when you have kills, it's actually a lot more easier to get closer to these cats. So initially, as you can see in this picture, there were a lot of livestock kills, but the Snow Leopard Conservancy came up with this brilliant plan where they brought in a wire mesh and covered the corrals, and it took something as simple as that to reduce the conflict by almost 95%. And that, mind you, it is 95% reduced now, simply because someone said, let's put a wire mesh so the snow leopard can't jump into the pen. And that's all it took. And in fact, once we, and along with the Snow Leopard Conservancy and a couple of other funders, uh, once we kind of got the lot of the houses in our landscape covered up, mainly by the Snow Leopard Conservancy, I have to be honest there, that we found that the snow leopards in the landscape were suddenly returning back to taking wild prey like ibex and urial. In fact, the whole of last year, before the unfortunate early shutdown in March, we had snow leopards killing only wild prey and no livestock. And that is how a simple change in the thought process can actually make a difference. In fact, we were talking about conservation-oriented tourism, a people-oriented setup. But because of the benefits of tourism, people are actually changing their lifestyle. They didn't mind their goats and sheep being killed because they were suddenly being compensated for that by the conservancy and by the guests. So it was very important to make sure their lifestyles weren't changed because of the new form of tourism that's coming in. So it is very important to make sure that their livestock and their way of life is also intact, and to also make sure the snow leopards were going after wild prey like they're meant to. So keeping both of this in mind, it has become a small change in the thought process, just like barely a year and a half or 2 years ago. And this is the kind of difference it's made. It's made the whole process more meaningful. So if you come to Ladakh, if you come to Snow Leopard Lodge or wherever you go, you can actually see that the locals are at the helm of conservation and at the helm of your experience. In fact, I go there as an expedition leader, but most of the time what I do is I make sure the locals are well introduced, and the ice is broken between the locals and the guests, and then they just take over. They are generally a very open, cheerful lot, and what they do and how they have actually changed their mindsets to welcome this whole conservation tourism ideology into their lifestyles, it actually requires a lot of commendation from the rest of the world. This is us after a happy time at Snow Leopard Lodge. This is our team. That's me grinning in the bottom, and of course our bunch of guests who decided to come back as soon as this whole lockdown situation is done. So I hope all of you join us. I hope you contribute. You have to realize, when you come to a place like this, you contribute a lot of, not just to the economy, you contribute to the ideologies, you contribute to the thought process, and you take a lot back. It is not just like visiting a national park to see a big cat. It is your going into a conservation process which is very well oiled and constantly evolving. So what I'll be saying today could be something totally different from what I'll say in a year or two from now, depending on what our learnings are. But definitely one of the most amazing big cat experiences on the planet, and I'm sure Latika can vouch for it also. And I hope to see you all soon in the landscape.
Thanks, Surya. That's amazing. Great presentation. I've been chatting with other members of your team, Hashim and Rohit Sharma, and we've been talking about all of the work that you've done with animals like brown bear and, the wolves and things. And will you tell us a little bit, very briefly, about this as well?
Well, I mean, like I said, like you just told everyone, I started my work in Satpura, which you can imagine was all bears for me, sloth bears. And I wasn't much into big cats at the start. And so when I got the chance to go to Ladakh, one of my key focus was to, of course, my duty was to find a good spot for the snow leopard and get to know that better. But a part of me always wanted to go find the brown bears, and that kind of was a draw for me. So 3 months into Ladakh, I decided to take a bus and go towards Western Ladakh, where I've heard there are bears in some areas. So my initial search was in the Suru Valley, and that's when I kind of had a very interesting encounters with bears. And I actually stayed with the Buckerwalls because they told me that the bears come for their sheep at night, and I actually spent some time in the caves along with them and saw my first bears there. But of course, part of me wanted to make it an experience which others can come and experience along with me, and not everyone can come and stay in a cave with Buckerwalls. So that's when we came across Dras and a few spots around there, and there was a lot to be done. Again, not a protected area, and the bears were hibernating through the winter months, and in the month of April, when they wake up with their young ones, usually they're extremely hungry, and their urge to feed takes them to the closest village. So again, a huge conflict area, a very different set of people. Most of them are tribal communities who have the Sheena origins in Dras. So it took me a while to understand the people, the wildlife, and all of that. And of course, Hashim and Rahul, all of them came in, and we tried doing something there, but of course it didn't work as smoothly as it did in central Ladakh with the Snow Leopards, because of course we had the backing of the Snow Leopard Conservancy there. But yes, it was an interesting experience.
Great.
And yeah, please go ahead.
So now, my concern now, and I think this is a concern all over the world, is what is going to happen with this whole pandemic lockdown and the embargo on international flights, and people worrying about being in the indoors. Of course, there's been talk of when it's really cold, the virus actually acts stronger, and it's really worrying. So people have been very skeptical about travel. How is this going to impact on people like Norbu? How is it going to impact on the village of Ule, and how is it going to change things if tourism doesn't come back in a big way for a year and a half?
Latika, it is pretty obvious what's going to happen when someone's economy and lifestyle has been changed by the new influx of a lot of money with snow leopard tourism. You have to realize that their lives, though self-sustaining and a very happy life, it wasn't financially as comfortable as what it is now because of the benefits of this. And not just Norbu, I'm talking about drivers, travel agents in Leh, hotel owners in Leh, other people in the village who are employed by the lodge, because suddenly they had a 12-month pattern to income, so before the winter months were just idle time. So of course it's going to affect it, and you of course know what happened in 2012 with the whole tourism ban that was being brought in by the Supreme Court, and then it was of course revoked. But in that time, if you remember, Latika, you know that how the villagers reacted. Some of them actually said, we'll burn down the forest if there's no income for us coming from it. And in fact, it happened in Kana and Bandhavgarh and a few places also. So in a situation like that, if you can imagine that happening to someone who's employed by the tourism industry, imagine the plight of people who are actually running the tourism industry. But having said that, I believe there is a future. I believe 2021 is going to be a good year. I believe that people will figure out a way, as they've always done. The challenges would be flights, larger hotels in Delhi, but wherever we come for wildlife experiences, isolation and social distancing is something which we do normally. It is not necessary that it's something we have to enforce separately. But the biggest challenge is going to be international flights and larger hotels. So that's something people will figure out, I feel. But right now, even all of us are in the dark with regards to what's going to happen.
Yeah, this is a big issue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's also all of this talk about climate change and the patterns of rainfall changing in Ladakh. And we've seen the great flash floods that have happened, and how greening is not necessarily a good solution for something like Ladakh. So can we talk a little bit about that, because this is not an issue that a lot of people discuss?
Of course. See, Latika, my time in Ladakh is basically the last 4.5 years. But most of what I'm saying is based on what I've heard and whatever I've seen in the 4 years. But what I've seen in the 4 years may not be a basis, because it's a very short period to assess the weather patterns of a region. But in general, whatever I've spoken, Ladakh is heavily dependent on the winter snowfall to make sure the water availability is there for the summer. In fact, I personally have seen that when the snow levels are higher in the winters, the flowering and the grasses and the amount of flora that explodes in the summer months is much higher as compared to a dry winter month. So there is a huge dependency on the winter snow. So what climate change has been doing in Ladakh is kind of breaking this pattern. They've been snow late into the month of May and June, which is when they farm. So you can imagine a blanket of snow over their young crop is going to cause a lot of havoc. And at the same time, if you have a snowless winter, though it's not a norm, like I said, it's a Trans-Himalaya, it's a cold desert, but it is bound to get some amount of snow. But if you have a snowless winter season, you're going to have streams drying up much faster. So solutions have been thought about. There are generally an intrinsic water conservation thought process in Ladakh with the local community. In fact, even at the lodge, we're thinking of going back to dry toilets, which the locals have been using, and not have wet toilets, which is what the world wants. And we are trying to figure out a comfortable way of doing it. But having said that, we have to study it a lot more to understand whether it is actually a short-term thing or something where a solution can be worked out. Like Ladakh, they've started this new ice stupas thing, which can supplement the water solution. But all of these are experiments, and it is good to do experiments, but the final solution is definitely going to be a while before we understand what exactly to do.
Okay, and so tell me also about things like waste generation and the heavier requirement for drinking water, bathing water. When you have huge influxes of tourists, does this actually impact on the villages, and does it affect the surrounding areas, because waste decomposition doesn't happen at these higher altitudes?
Yeah.
So
absolutely, Latika. So
how does this affect?
It is probably the biggest problem in Ladakh. It is the biggest problem right now in Ladakh because there has been a huge influx of tourists, especially in the 4 months of summer. Suddenly the number of people which can come in a year can go between 100,000 to 200,000. I'm just talking about 4 months. And of course, a lot of it is spoken about as a tourist problem, but local lifestyles have also changed. People are progressing there and they're learning from outside. You can definitely say the outsiders have the blame for it, but their local lifestyles have changed. And the usage of things and their way of living has also changed. So there is a very dire need for a solution for all this. Right now, everything is being dumped in a particular place outside Leh, and they set fire. And this kind of waste generation, both by civilians and the army and the tourists, has, in my eye, the biggest problem that it has caused is the outburst of a huge number of feral dogs throughout Ladakh. And you've been seeing that, Latika. You saw it when you came also. And our wolves and the breeding Saras cranes and the breeding birds and the Urial, which live around the Indus Valley, all of them have been heavily affected by these dogs. In fact, the wolves have been crossbreeding with dogs to such an extent that for 2 years in between in Ule, we only saw the crosses and we never saw true wolves. And that is extremely worrying. So trash can actually complicate things which you don't naturally see with the naked eye, like unless you're there in the landscape, something like the wolf story. But having said that, there is now some effort. There is a setup for waste management in Choglamsar. There is a plastic ban which is slowly being imposed in the hotels in Leh. There is actually a water consumption norm or a guideline which is going to be brought in. So a lot of it is going to be done. But again, like I told you, it is something which we have to wait and see how it is implemented. We can't implement the same solutions which we do in Bombay or Ahmedabad or Gujarat as we do in Ladakh. Like you said, the decomposition rates are a lot slower, and the kind of waste generated and where it can be dumped, and the wind, of course, takes waste through a larger area. So we'll have to figure out a lot of things. But from our end at Snow Leopard Lodge, we don't use plastic, and we use the kabadi wala extremely on a regular basis, so that our waste is taken to the kabadi wala in the Leh market, who takes it to someone in Jammu, and everything is recycled. And our efforts year after year is definitely focused on reducing the amount we are actually taking back from Ule after every group. We're trying to quantify it, measure it, and figure out a solution. But if the Leh authorities figure out a solution on their part, everything complements each other and can go a long way in changing the way we look at Ladakh or tourism in Ladakh.
Fantastic. I also wanted to understand, have you ever seen examples of snow leopards actually coming and scavenging on meat waste that has been disposed of in these sites? Have you had any examples of that?
No, Latika. I have not actually seen that, though I have seen that when snow leopard come close to villages, the dogs do chase them away. But again, that is something where we can't assume they're coming for the waste. They could actually be just passing through or coming for a live domestic animal. So I actually haven't seen a snow leopard going and feeding on waste. Probably because there is food availability. But I've seen brown bears do it heavily.
Yes, bears do it. Yeah.
Foxes, wolves. I've seen stone martens do it. Weasels do it. Generally, the omnivores and the more adaptable animals do it. I personally haven't heard of or come across a snow leopard doing it, so I can't comment on the matter on that. So.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, now there's another amazing cat that we haven't talked about at all, which is the lynx, which shares and overlaps with the snow leopard. Tell us about the lynx. Have you come across it? What do you know about it?
Oh yeah, so lynx, of course, that is in a way, the Pallas's cat and the lynx were something I was really after, looking for the snow leopard. So the lynx, as per literature and as per the work that Dr. Raghu has done and a few Otto Pfister and a few people have done, the Changtang area, which is the extension of Tibet into Ladakh, and the Nubra Valley seem to be the best spots. But what we saw was that in places where there is a thick scrub, even on the higher mountain slopes like Gandala in Rumbak, like Yurutse, Warila, Changla, all those places, lynxes were actually distributed in all these spots. So there is no pattern to this in some way, but you can say that when the habitat was rife and there was enough woolly hairs available to prey on, or enough pikas available to prey on, the lynxes were there. So in Ule, unfortunately, we don't have any lynxes because we don't have as many woolly hair or a thick bush as you've seen. But in a place like Yurutse or in Nubra or Warila, the landscape and the vegetation is different. So lynxes are there. So I've seen lynx in Nubra, of course, and I've seen lynx in Yurutse in Rumbak. I've got a glimpse in the Changtang area, but I won't count it. But I know of a few pockets in Ladakh where you can see them. And if you actually look at the photographs of lynx from different parts, some people say it's a subspecies. The ones in Nubra are more red in color. The ones in Yurutse are grey. I haven't seen enough to comment on that, but definitely not a small cat. I can tell you that much. It is a 26 to 25 kilograms. People have seen it bring down a barrel, which is the prey of a snow leopard. People have seen it bring down Markhor, as the new video was released in Pakistan. So definitely not a small cat, a powerful muscular cat with a short tail, tall ears, very similar to anything we would imagine, like a caracal or like an Iberian lynx or a Canadian lynx. So in a lot of ways, or a bobcat, a lot of ways very similar in behavior and habitat, but unfortunately very poorly studied in the landscape. So we don't know the numbers, like we don't know with the snow leopards. We don't know the numbers, we don't know the diet, we don't know their patterns. But recently, from whatever I've seen, I can see that they have 2 to 3 young ones. People have been seeing them regularly in some parts of Ladakh. So yes, a lot of indirect evidences, but no consistent study. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, this of course brings another thought to mind for those of us who are really hardcore, keen cat people. This is actually a good time and a great opportunity to practice social distancing and do more immersive, longer holidays, and
Absolutely.
get people like yourselves to go off and do a search for the brown bear or the lynx or something like that, and just do a little private trip and do a longer stay. And that actually might help with the tourism problem also, because at least there'll be sustained income coming in for villagers, and it's not necessarily about mass tourism, but it's about the quality of the experience. So I think this is a great time to be doing this.
Yeah, I think that we should always be doing that, but unfortunately, this is when we realize that we can do it.
Yes, absolutely. And the Pallas's cat. Tell us about the Pallas's cat.
So, the Pallas's cat, it is probably the weirdest animal I've seen, Latika.
Okay.
So, the Latin name Ontocolobus manul literally means ugly ears. A cat, an animal with ugly ears, and that's what it means. So I spent one autumn looking for the Pallas's cat because I'd already gone up before the snow leopard season started. So I had a little bit of spare time. So in Ladakh, there are a few places where it's been recorded, but of course, the extreme eastern tip of the Changtang Plateau is where people say the Pallas's cat can be better seen, though there are reports from other places. So I went to this place, Hanle, as you know it, and I spoke to one of the homestay owners. He directed me to a few spots to look for Pallas's cats. And one morning, I remember, left early morning, 5:30, of course, freezing cold, and then reached this rocky outcrop that the homestay owner mentioned. And right behind it, there's this vertical cliff with a lot of holes in it. And of course, early morning, twilight, I'm putting my binoculars through these holes, and you see this small white thing looking back at me. And I have no idea. It's a hole and there's a face, it's dark. So I had a decent camera then, so I took some shots, zoomed in, boosted up the ISO, all the jazz, and of course there was this Pallas's cat looking back at me, and I was like, wow, I mean, who would have thought? And then this thing walks out from the hole to climb further up the rock, probably as a reaction to me. I don't know what it is, but what it has, Latika, was this hairy mass coming out of both its sides. So it actually looks like an animal which is just floating because you can't see the legs, and it's just a whole lot of hair walking, and it just went and sat in its place, sat there the whole day, swapped at some birds, and they actually have middens like rhinos, so they deposit their droppings in a particular place, and it comes out regularly for that in the day. So I actually spent the whole day with that cat, and it was fantastic, but definitely one of the most weird animals I have come across. Forget about cats, any animal. Yeah.
Amazing. So I've had a very close relationship with Ladakh, because my grandparents used to be in Srinagar, and the first time I went there was in the 70s.
Wow.
With the army, a long time ago. And
I wasn't born then.
And when Ashish and Joanna were filming, and then when Raghu was doing his PhD work, they would all come to the farm to my grandparents' place, and so I've known them pretty much for a long time. So, but I've never seen a Pallas's cat. I've seen lots of pictures and met people who've seen it, but that's on my list. I really want to go.
We'll try once. I heard Sikkim is also good nowadays, along with the sandfox. There are parts of Sikkim which is also good for the Pallas's cat. But of course, Mongolia is the spot if you really want to get a sure shot and things like that.
Well, God willing, we'll all be traveling soon. So,
God willing, yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. That's been really super interesting, and I think we go back with thoughts on what to do to help with the conservation tourism situation, because that seems to be the key for lessening animosity and decreasing human-wildlife conflict, especially with the snow leopards. Today, this is a great beginning, because I think when the industry comes together, and for the first time you have scientists, tourism people, photographers and naturalists coming together to talk about issues, it's a great beginning and a very strong message going out. So great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Latika.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope to catch you. Bye.
Bye.
Documented a pride for the last 18 years. So I went back, I gathered information, I kind of put these pieces together, and I had 18 years of a lion pride's life.